I hope everybody's doing good. I'm excited about this one. Today, I'm gonna teach you guys how to use Midjourney, Runway ML, and After Effects to create another visual effects shot. We're gonna take a Midjourney image, we're gonna break it apart into different elements. Then we're gonna take a low quality image, we're gonna run it through Stable Diffusion through an upscale process. And then we're gonna take that upscaled image, bring that into Runway ML, animate it, bring it back into After Effects and composite everything together. This is the shot we're gonna work on. Let's get into it. So I created this image in Midjourney and I was like, what the f? And then I brought it into Photoshop to cut out the elevator. I used the pen tool and got super meticulous. Then after that, I made a path and I named it Elevator. And then I expanded that selection in order to use the generative AI fill to remove that elevator from the background, because what I wanted to do was use the background without the elevator as an image in Runway ML to do a slight dolly in. Photoshop Generative Fill did a great job at cutting out that elevator. Then after I cut out the elevator, what I needed to do was start cleaning up the edges so that there's no leftover pixels from the original background. So I went in there with the rubber stamp tool and started rubber stamping the wires out, filling in new parts. I also cut out the window so that I can make it transparent. And once I created the window path, I named it Window. Then I went back into the elevator mat and filled that selection with black so that when the elevator animates upward, we can see the buildings and the circuitry behind the window. If I would have had this just as a regular flat image, the background would have moved along with the elevator. So I made a selection of that window and I made a slight shimmer on the edge in order for me to composite it back into After Effects. Once all my elements were cut out, I expanded the whole canvas upward so that Runway ML has enough pixels to work with. Once all the elements were cleaned up and cut out, I brought that image into Runway ML without the elevator, and then I prompted the camera slowly zooms into a wall made of computer components. So here you go, I'm generating. And Runway did an amazing job at understanding what I wanted. I think it took 4 tries, and most of those tries were really good from the get. Some of them were a little faster, some of them were a little slower, but the good thing about After Effects is you can bring these assets in and you can slow them down, speed them up. It was more about picking the right one. Once Runway rendered out the footage for me, I brought that into After Effects and I 3D tracked that footage. I made sure I went down to the advanced options and I clicked on detailed analysis. This gives the 3D tracker more details to track. All these elements are different angles. So the trick was to find the flattest angle. Once I found the flattest part of the footage, I made sure that I created a solid and a camera. I noticed that the angle was a little off, so I started rotating it so that it matches the elements on the wall. I imported the elevator asset and I brought it into the comp. I moved it over to make sure that I align it to where I want it to be in the comp. And then I turned it into a 3D layer. After that, I parented to the solid. You can see that the elevator is moving with the footage, but that's not where it ended. I had to scale it up and I had to reposition it to make sure that it was in the position where it originally was in the Midjourney image. Being that this is a flat asset and not actual 3D, I had to rotate it to compensate for the way the solid was rotated. So now I'm just scrubbing back and forth, making sure that it actually looks like it sticks onto that footage. And then after that, I want to animate that elevator moving up slowly. I added 2 keyframes, one at the beginning of the comp, that the elevator starts off slightly lower, and then one at the end of the comp where the elevator animates up. So we have these 2 movements going on and none of them are competing with each other. Now, the next thing about this shot was to cut out the elements on the side of the elevator so that they're overlaid on top of the elevator. All right, now we're in Mocha AE. I'm going to select all of the elements that are touching that elevator. So I did this for maybe around 6 elements. I selected them and tracked them. I had to do this for 5 extra elements. So I'm gonna speed up this process. I copied the background layer, I overlaid it on the elevator, and I used the apply matte in Mocha AE to apply all those mattes back onto that footage. I added a 1 pixel feather around those edges because they were a little bit too rigid. This looks a little bit more realistic. So there you go, I'm just playing it over and over, making sure that it's believable. So once I had all those elements masked and overlaid on the elevator, I noticed Runway added extra contrast and saturation to the footage. So I added a levels effect. I set 2 keyframes, 1 keyframe where I'm gonna color correct the footage, and then the last keyframe is gonna be set at its default settings. I raised the blacks a tiny bit, and then I lowered the whites a tiny bit so that when we animate in between both keyframes, there's a seamless transition. Once I scrubbed through the footage and I saw that everything was working, I wanted to add reflections to the body of the elevator and the windows. So here what I'm doing is I'm copying the background footage, I'm shifting it over to the left slightly so that the elements in the elevator mirror the elements in the background. So then I use the elevator as a matte so that the reflections only live within the elevator. So now you get the reflections in the window and the reflections on the body of the elevator. Then I lower the opacity slightly so that I can see the reflections in the window and the reflections on the body. Then after that, I saw that the reflections were a little too crisp, so I added a fast box blur in order to soften up those reflections. Then after that, I noticed that the reflections lived on the whole elevator. And what I needed to do was soften up the edges for them to live on the right side of the elevator. So I created a green matte, I softened up the edges, and I inverted the matte. I brought the matte over to the right in order to find the best place on that elevator for those reflections to live on. It's always good to go through the blend modes to find a blend mode that works with the shot. The blend mode I used for this was a screen blend mode. Once I saw that the reflections were looking good, that the blend mode was looking good, I wanted to break up the reflections into 2 pieces. One reflection for the window and one for the body. So the reflection on the body of the elevator will be a little bit softer and more diffused as opposed to the reflection of the window. I went back into the project and duplicated the elevator comp. Once I created that new comp, I brought it back into the main comp, brought it to the top, and then I went back into the elevator comp. I created a green solid, and then I started masking out to the shape of the window. And once I created the matte for the window, I turned off all the other layers and made sure that I used that new window matte for the window reflection. Then after that, I turned off the fast box blur in order for the reflection on the window to be a little bit crisper. And then I started repositioning the reflection in order for it to align to the left side so that we get a realistic reflection in there. After creating the reflections, I noticed that the reflections were doing their own thing because the reflections were still moving based on the original runway footage. So what I needed to do was go to the end of the shot and freeze that frame so the reflections are static. So I needed to turn these reflections into 3D layers. After I turned them into 3D layers, I parented them back onto the original solid that the 3D camera tracker had created. So now once they're tracked on that solid, they're moving based on that dolly. So I had to reposition, rotate, and scale it back to the size of the comp to have a static reflection that follows the movement of the whole comp. The same way we tracked the elevator onto that solid and it moved with the whole shot, that's the same exact process I had to do with the reflections. And if you notice, you can see the matte that was created with the original elevator asset. I'm making sure that those reflections live in the area they need to live in. And this was a little back and forth, but sometimes things don't work out in the beginning, so you have to troubleshoot. So now we have the static reflections that are following the movement of the camera. Once I fixed up the reflections, I had to go back into the mask and fix up the mask on the edge and making sure that I created keyframes so that mask animates with the whole shot. As I was playing the footage back and forth, I noticed I needed some kind of shadow underneath the elevator just to make it look more realistic. I created a gray solid. I masked out the edges at the bottom where the shadow should live. I softened up the mask. Once it looked good to me, I parented that shadow layer onto the elevator so that shadow moves with the elevator. Once I did that, I played it a couple of times and I was like, this looks really good. After looking at the shot over and over and over, there was the shadows at the top of the elevator that were bugging me. I brought that elevator element back into Photoshop and I selected that area at the top. I wrote remove. And then I used the elevator to mat out that generative fill fix-up. And then I exported that element back out. I swapped out the original elevator element, and when I went back into After Effects, it automatically updated in the file. So now we have an elevator that looks a little bit more cleaned up. Once I went through the shot and kept on looking at it, the elevator felt like a flat asset tracked onto this nice 3D scene. So I used the Liquify tool to create a fake 3D shift. I applied the Liquify effect to that elevator comp. As soon as you start getting in there and you pick the right brush size, the right pressure, then you start getting this nice shift. I had to make the brush bigger to shift those edges to the right a bit. You can't go quick with this process. You have to make sure those lines remain vertical. Once I got to a place where the Liquify effect looked good, I added a keyframe to the distortion percentage. So we go from no distortion to full distortion. So here in the first frame, I brought down the distortion percentage to 0. And in the last frame, I kept it at 100. All right, so now we're here in the main comp. And as you can see, I was able to add a fake 3D shift to the element in order to make it feel like it's in 3D space. It was time to go back into the After Effects comp and have the woman and the elements of the elevator subtly move a little bit slower than the Liquify effect. Then I created a green solid. I masked it out to the shape of the main hole in the elevator window. Then I parented the matte to the elevator body and inverted it. So now we have a hole on that main window. So I added 2 keyframes and I moved the inside of the elevator slightly to the right. I went back and forth and just made sure that both elements felt like they were moving at different speeds. And that's what gives off this fake 3D effect. So here you go, I'm out in the main timeline. Once I got that parallax shift to feel good, I brought that elevator element back into Photoshop. I'm making a selection of the lady and the background, and I'm gonna invert it and use Photoshop Generative Fill to fill in the areas. So what I wrote here was remove elevator. There you go. Photoshop created all the elements it thought should be in the elevator. So now we're here back in After Effects, and I'm gonna swap out this layer with that new asset that I just created, and boom. So now we have that elevator inside element that doesn't have the elevator frame and borders. So now when we're doing that parallax effect, it looks more realistic going back out into the timeline, and it looks a little bit more realistic. All right, so once the parallax shift worked, it was time to go back into Photoshop and cut the lady out. So I selected the lady and I used Photoshop's Generative Fill to add all those elements of the background back in. I was able to bring that back into After Effects so that we have the elevator element with the Liquify effect, the woman and the elevator inside sandwiched. Think about it. The passive viewer is going to look at this shot and take it for what it is. They're not going to know that we...
How would they know?
It was time to take the low quality image that Midjourney created and bring it into Stable Diffusion to get this low quality image looking like this beautiful upscaled image. So here we're in Stable Diffusion. I used a checkpoint called Epic Realism, and I added a negative to the bottom that I already have as a preset. So I try to describe that image as best as I can. So when we're doing the upscaling, Stable Diffusion knows what to do with the image. If you leave the prompt box empty, Stable Diffusion is going to interpret the image the way it wants to interpret it. But here you go. I'm just typing in that prompt real quick. There you go. And then once I got the prompt, it was time for me to drag in the low quality Midjourney image. Just going through the settings real quick. I use DPM SDE Caras, sampling steps 25. And then I went down and used an extension called Roop. What Roop does is it takes the image of a face and it superimposes it on anyone. So here I'm using Bjork's image in Roop in order to superimpose it on this young lady with the yellow sundress. There you go. And then once I clicked on Roop and I enabled it, I went to the Denoise Strength and I bumped up the Denoise Strength to 0.33. So when you deal with the Denoise Strength, the higher it is, the more it changes the image. The lower it is, the more it tries to stay true to the image. So I found that 0.33 allows me to stray away from the image a little bit, but still maintain the original image. There was another extension I used called Tiled Diffusion. What Tiled Diffusion does is it allows you to upscale your image. It analyzes the image and adds detail. I don't know how this does this. So here I am, I'm going down to Tiled Diffusion, turning it on, changing the method to mixture of diffusers, clicking on the 4X NMKD Superscale SP 17800G upscaler. Then after that, I enabled Tiled VAE. That's a good feature to use if you don't have the best graphics card. After I had the correct settings, it was time to generate the image. So let's generate the image and see what we get. Boom. As you can see, we were able to Roop Bjork's face onto this character. Look at the details, the dress, everything. That was awesome, but we're not done yet. Her eyes are slightly closed. So Stable Diffusion has another feature called Inpainting. You can basically draw over things, prompt whatever you want that thing to be switched out with, and Stable Diffusion just fills those areas in. So I clicked on the Send to Inpaint button. So here you go, we're drawing over her eyes. Boom, there you go, drew over the eyes. And once I drew over the eyes, I deleted the prompt and wrote eyes looking at camera. If you leave the prompt the same, Stable Diffusion is going to try to create a sundress over her eyes, right? Then I ran it again. If we look at the image, that's crazy. Stable Diffusion did a great job at fixing those eyes. Once I got an image that looked good, I dragged that image back into image to image to upscale it by 2. I went back down and turned Tiled Diffusion back on and Tiled VAE back on. I needed to grab the original prompt and put it back into that prompt box for Stable Diffusion to know what to do with this second upscale pass. So then I ran it again, and look at what Stable Diffusion did. Incredible. It added way more details in the second upscale pass. Look at the hair, the eyes, the skin texture, the dress. It just looks amazing. One thing I noticed was that the left sleeve was silky and see-through. So I clicked on the Send to Inpaint button and I zoomed in on an image and just painted over that sleeve. I changed the prompt to read pastel yellow sundress, ruffled sleeve. Then I bumped up the Denoise Strength to 0.45. We had to bump up the denoise so that Stable Diffusion has more creativity. And then I ran that again, and boom. Once I got an image that looked really good, I dragged that image back into image to image to run Tiled Diffusion again. I brought down the Denoise Strength to 0.33 because I didn't want Stable Diffusion to change the image more than what it is. We needed to copy the original prompt back in again so that we can do this next upscale. So here you go, I copied in that prompt and I'm turning Tiled Diffusion back on. Tiled VAE back on. Whenever you're doing a third upscale, you need to click on Fast Encode Color Fix. What this does is it tries to maintain the original saturation contrast levels of your image. And then I ran it again, let it do its thing. There you go. And as you can see, the image looks amazing. The face looks really good. The sundress looks good. Look at her hand. The veins in her hands look really good. And it even created some yellow Nike sneakers, which is crazy. It was time to take this into Photoshop. So now we're here in Photoshop, and here I'm using the quick subject select tool. I'm just gonna cut her out, add a mask. I placed that image into a 1920 by 1080 Photoshop document. I added a green background and I exported that image to use in Runway. Now we're here in Runway ML, and what we're gonna do is import that image, and we're gonna prompt static camera. Woman is smiling, looking around, surprised, expression on her face, muted color palette. We're gonna use the first frame feature. Let's run that and see what happens. And as you can see, Runway did an amazing job. Like, how did it understand that I wanted that? And then how did it inject that into the footage? I'm dumbfounded. Let's go back into After Effects. Once I imported that runway footage into After Effects, it was time to key the green out of the footage. So I used Keylight and I sampled the green from the background. Then I started messing around with the screen matte to make the matte pure white and pure black. This cuts out the subject from the green background. After I had a decent key, I went into the elevator comp. I grabbed the comp where we keyed out the lady and swapped it into the asset of the lady image. And we're starting to position it. There you go. So now we get that parallax in there. She's doing her thing inside the elevator. I took the runway footage and I parented to that original keyframe background movement so that her and the background move together at the same time. So here we are back in the main timeline and it doesn't feel right. So we still have to go back into the footage and start color correcting so that we make sure that that dress remains yellow. Make sure that we tone down the red in her skin. So let's go through that process real quick. We're gonna apply a levels effect. We're gonna go down to the red channel to take some red out of her skin. So a good way to work on shots like this is to have a side-by-side view, because it's hard to jump between the main comp and the comp you're working on. This part right here takes a little bit because this shot is nice and pastel. So I want to match those tones. All right, so I noticed that the woman was looking a little too sharp. It was time to add a fast box blur to the footage in order to make her blend into the elevator and the scene a little bit better. I noticed that she was a little too saturated, so I added a hue and saturation effect and desaturated her slightly just so she can fit in the shot a little bit better. Once I desaturated the footage, I noticed that it was still too contrasty. I turned on the original low quality Midjourney image, and I'm using the hair as a reference because the hair is the darkest part of the footage. So I went back into the levels effect and I raised the black slightly to match the black levels of the scene. Now, when I raised those black levels and they started looking good, I noticed that her skin was still looking a little too red for me. So I went back into the levels effect and started messing around with the green channel to add a little bit of green back into her skin in order for the skin to look a little bit more natural. So now we're gonna pre-render it and check out the shot and see what's going on. All right, this is looking good. We're almost done. All right, so after playing the footage over and over, I decided to swap out the footage that I had for another piece of footage that I thought worked better. I needed her to be surprised about her surroundings, to be in awe. And I think this piece of footage worked way better for this shot. And being that we already did all the color correction, all I needed to do was swap out the piece of footage and all the color correction, the keying, the levels just transferred over. And I noticed that her skin wasn't matching the highlights on the footage. So what I did was I applied a Lumetri color effect, and then I went down to the basic correction drop down. I am working on the whites and highlights. Once I tackled those highlights with the Lumetri color and it felt good, that's it. I was happy with the shot. I played it over and over just to see if anything stuck out. And I was like, oh, this is it. We got it. I know this was a long one, but I had a lot of fun experimenting and seeing how I combine After Effects and AI images and AI videos. I hope you guys learned something. Hit me up, leave some comments, like, subscribe, all that good jazz. Peace.